potential already within us that we haven't tapped.
And he told me about Joe and his work with alpha feedback, and so I built a little alpha feedback device, electronic, that made a tone whenever the person showed alpha.
A number of years ago where I predicted that EEG biofeedback would go nowhere. And boy, was I wrong on that one.
Trust in what your teachers are saying, but verify.
I'm Tom Budzynski, and right now I'm living in Poulsbo, Washington. And I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a private practice, and with my wife Helen, we do a little research out of the University of Washington.
Can you tell me how you were first introduced to the concept of biofeedback?
Yeah, I was a grad student in 1965 at the University of Colorado. One of my teachers was Johann Stoiber, who had just finished a fellowship with Joe Camilla at Langley Porter. And he told me about Joe and his work with alpha feedback, and so I built a little alpha feedback device, electronic, that made a tone whenever the person showed alpha. And using this somewhat crude device, I desensitized a guy because I was interested in behavior therapy. And he had a thanatophobia, or a fear of death-related objects. And we did a straightforward desensitization, but in between scenes we would feed him the alpha tone, and he would use his own EEG to make more alpha and therefore relax. It was a very successful desensitization, and he got over his thanatophobia, and I've known him for over 30 years now, and he's still maintaining the diminution of that fear. I took it to Langley Porter to see Joe about a year later and tell him about that case. And Joe Camilla and I went to Haight-Ashbury, this was in 1966, and had a nice lunch, and I told Joe about the case. And he was more interested in nirvana at that time, using alpha to get to nirvana. So I went back, and we had a brown bag luncheon at our own Department of Psychiatry, and in which cases were presented at that time. I presented this case, and they weren't very impressed, and they said, look, if you want to feed back something, why fool around with brain waves? Why don't you just feed back muscles? And so Johann said, Tom, can you make a thing that feeds back muscles? And I said, well, we can try. And with my good friend John Pichettino, who was an electronic engineer, as I was at Hughes Aircraft, we were good friends out there, and he was now in Boulder, Colorado. We designed the first EMG biofeedback device. We called it BIFS, Bioelectric Information Feedback System. And it had 3 kinds of light displays and a number of auditory feedbacks. And it converted the surface EMG into NIXI to readouts. It was the first time that was done. There was a thing called a constant reset level integrator that was designed in Europe by a couple of Englishmen, Sainsbury and Gibson. And essentially you put in the raw EMG, which looks like grass, and the output is a rising wave that resets at intervals after it gets to a certain level. You just count the number of resets per unit time, and that's a measure of how much stuff is coming in. And you can calibrate it very precisely to read in microvolts, produce so many resets per unit time. And then all you have to do is use NIXI tubes to count the number of resets in a minute, calibrate it, and so on, so you got a readout in microvolts, peak to peak, or whatever you want to do. And so that was our first EMG device, and we used it for a number of studies. And then about 2 years after that, and we were also in a group of 7 people that exchanged information about what didn't have a name yet. It was this feedback principle. It was Barbara Brown, Joe Camilla, Joe Hart, Elmer Green, Manager Foundation, Barry Sturman, and a few others. I don't know if Barry contributed to the exchange of information, but we knew about his work. And Barbara decided to have a meeting in 1969, because it was getting to be a bigger and bigger group every year. And so we met in Santa Monica with a small group of folks, 20 or 30 people, and we chose a name. The name was Biofeedback. we had offered the name bioelectric information feedback, but that was sort of clumsy. Barry, I think, submitted autoregulation, which sounded a little too mechanical. And somebody hit on biofeedback. It was the perfect name. Everybody loved it, and we voted on that, and that's how the name was born. So the result of that meeting, it was tape recorded by Barbara Brown's assistant. And later on, a poor secretary had to go and listen to this tape, and she didn't know who we were, and she had to try to figure out whose name was associated with what was being said. And there were all kinds of misattributions, and some of the stuff I said was attributed to, someone else, and so on and so forth. And George Watmore was there too, from Seattle. George got up and made an impassioned speech about how this new technology could be used for the worse. People could make these units in their garage and basements and, destroy the world, like an atom bomb. Everybody saying, George, maybe that's a little too much, we don't think it's going to do that. But so anyway, George was warning everybody. And but he was a grand old man, and the champion of the Jacobson progressive relaxation technique. So that's how it kind of all started, and we went back home and did a lot more work with EMG. And eventually alpha EEG got kind of a bad name and kind of went underground for a while, or EEG in general. But Elmer Green and our lab continued to work with theta feedback, and Barry continued his work with SMR for epilepsy. And our work was focused on sleep problems. We would train people first on frontal EMG, lowering that down, and then we'd teach them alpha, and then we'd teach them theta. And once they had that training, they could go to sleep in 20 minutes quite readily. It was used for the military. It was going to be used for the military during the Vietnam War. We had a grant from ARPA, as did a lot of people. And we used to meet in San Diego once every year and present our data. And a lot of good research came out of that funding. But the war ended, and so then we could use it for civilian problems, and we did. And I invented a thing called a twilight learning machine, which was finally written up in Psychology Today in August of 1977. They did an interesting article called Tuning In on the Twilight Zone. And my good friend, what was his name, Goldman, was an associate editor of Psychology Today. He later went on to write a number of books, famous books now. And Daniel Goldman. And so he got me the article because he knew me, and so it was an interesting article, but unfortunately it was way ahead of its time. Essentially what it said was, in order to change a person's deeply held beliefs and attitudes, negative ones hopefully, you had to get deep inside. You had to get beyond the conscious defenses, and one way to do that was to look at the EEG over the left side of the brain, and when it went into theta, that meant it was dropping all the alpha and beta consciousness and defenses. And sure enough, if you search for a pure theta with no beta or alpha present in that EEG, you were unconscious. And that's when the tape recorder would turn on and present the affirmations that you'd created with the patient. And so it worked quite well, actually. It was a fairly big unit made by John Piccittino in Boulder at Biofeedback Systems, Inc. So we had some very interesting cases that we presented. They were to be reviewed and summarized in an article for Rob Call's book, which never came out. So I have a big chapter, along with a lot of other people have big chapters that never got published in Rob Call's book. But someday they might find their way somewhere else. But the Twilight Learning machine, as neat as it was, as interesting as it was, I I found that I could do some of the same work with hypnosis, and so I put it aside and turned my therapy tools to the hypnotic technique. And for years, I had my own clinic in Denver for about 18 years, and I did a lot of hypnotic work and a lot of work with people that had problems in childhood and so on that were now bothering them as adults. And we used to use ideomotor signaling to kind of dig for unconscious process, zero in on when it occurred, and so on. And I really enjoyed that work. But then all sorts of lawsuits sprang up in the late 70s and 80s regarding hypnotic work. And so I dropped it along with a lot of other people. And neurofeedback came along. And now the old alpha machine that I invented way back when, and Joe Camilla had one too, they were now converted into machines that worked off computers. And I can remember some of those annual meetings in which these computerized systems were there for the first time in the exhibit area, and everybody walking by and say, "Oh, those things will never work as good as standalones," you know. Computers don't, they don't have the sensitivity of humans, And lo and behold, about 2 years later, everything was computerized systems, and so we were all using them as we do today. And so that kind of brings us right up to date, and that's where I am right now. Although we do some interesting research now, getting into energy medicine. My wife and I were in Europe. I had to give a talk at Heidelberg a couple of years ago, and my nephew was a tour guide in Berlin and getting his Ph.D. at the time, and so we met him and took him to Heidelberg. My family had never seen me present anything ever, and so for the first time my nephew was able to watch me at Heidelberg, and that was quite a thrill for both of us. And while there, we met an interesting physician named Karl Merritt, who was born in Hamburg and is now working out of California, but he lectures mostly in Europe on energy medicine, and he introduced us to the concepts, and he gave us some strange patches that we tried out, and they were supposed to increase your energy and your endurance and decrease stress. And I found that I could increase in my weightlifting, the poundage that I was using. I've been a weightlifter all my life, and now suddenly in my 70s I was able to do more than I had even through my 60s and 50s. So that was good. And then we did a research study, and we looked at heart rate variability with these devices. And we had a placebo group, so it was a double blind, and the technician or the therapist didn't know which patches he was putting on. And we got a decrease in VLF, a very low frequency component of the heart rate variability, which is a key component because it signals stress or anxiety in the individual. If you decrease that, that means you've done a good job at relaxing them, decreasing the stress at that moment on their heart, decreased the sympathetic drive to the heart, as it were. And these patches did that. That was the main thing they did. So that was fascinating research. We also worked with AVS, audiovisual stimulation, using that with a group of elderly people. Well, first we did students. We heard that Korean kids were using AVS machines to give them better grades on exams. And so we said, wow, let's see if that really works. So we looked at kids up at University of Western Washington University, WW, in Bellingham, Washington. And these were kids that had sought out the guidance counselors because they were in trouble in school. And so we asked this group, in addition to getting guidance counseling, would you like to try a new technique, which wouldn't take much time? And it involved them coming in and having 30 minutes of AVS, audiovisual stimulation, at 2 frequencies alternating back and forth. And I think it was 14 and 22 hertz. And there was a rationale for both of them. And that's what they did for 30 sessions. And we had their grade point average for 1 quarter at least. We looked at them the quarter that they were trained, and then we looked at them the next quarter. And there was a control group, and they were tested before and after with a number of different tests, word lists and different things like that. And we also, the big thing there was a GPA. And if we could change the GPA, we knew we had something. And indeed, the trained group in the quarter following the training, compared with their baseline before they had any training, had improved significantly on grade point average. The controls did not. So we knew that this AVS technique did help them. And so we then applied it to elderly people that we were kind of interested in. I'd done a lot of work with the elderly up to that point. We called it brain brightening. And we had 10 stations, all driven off one master unit created by David Seaver. It was good enough to lend us the equipment. And so all the people got their training all at the same time. They could individually adjust intensity and sound. And they had 30 sessions of a pseudo-random program that I created, which meant that the lights and sounds changed almost randomly every second. So their brain couldn't get a picture of what was going on, so it kept the blood flow up, going high, we'd hoped. And we tested them with microcogs before and after. The microcog test is pretty sensitive to 9 different cognitive abilities. And they improved on memory, which is one of the things that we were most interested in. So that was the key factor in the microcog that improved, and we were glad that it did so. So we then tried it with a very special case of Alzheimer's disease. And we had a good, not a good friend, but a person we became a friend. It was a friend of a friend. And she was only in her 50s. Both parents had died of Alzheimer's, and she was diagnosed with it, and her symptoms were galloping along quite fast. We did cues before, during the flashing of the AVS, right afterwards, 20 minutes later, and then we did them at intervals. She entered the program of 30 sessions with the older people, finished that, we did another cue, and then we looked at her 2 years after that. And all these cues were subjected to Loretta analysis as well. And so we have some very interesting pre-post differences as a result of the flashing of the light. Just one I'll mention, and we're still preparing the paper for publication, but just one. She had a lot of delta in both temporal areas. The flashing took the delta away from the left temporal area, but not the right. 2 weeks after we did that little test, she had a PET scan down at the medical center, and the PET scan revealed that her Alzheimer's was far worse on the right side in the temporal area, and that's where the AVS hadn't touched anything as far as we could tell with the first couple of cues. But the left side, mysteriously enough, had no delta in it. And they were wondering, because they had earlier scans, they were wondering why the slow frequencies had disappeared from the left temporal area. But we knew the answer, but of course we told the doctor, but they just dismissed it. What's that? I don't understand what you're talking about. Anyway, this lady just died recently. She lived quite a few years after we did that testing. And she was supposed to die probably within a year, but she lived at least 5 or 6 years later, more, before she passed away. And one of the reasons that we think she didn't live a little longer was that even though we gave her a home unit, she stopped using it shortly after we finished our testing. And her family didn't really push it for her use. So what we're now into, Helen and I, is an examination of some of the energy medicine approaches, seeing if we can find dependent variables that we know how to use, such as EEG and heart rate variability. And so we're going to be applying those variables to see change as people use energy medicine techniques. That kind of brings it up to date.
Anything else you can add, if I think of a general theme of the birth of biofeedback? Any other stories you can add to that broad category?
Yeah, the first couple of meetings were always very intriguing. I was program chairman for the third annual meeting. Barbara Brown did the first two, and then she backed off, and I was program chairman on my own for the third one. And then the fourth one, Eric Pepper and I handled it as co-program chairman. And then after that, other people took over and were chairpersons. But in those days, you try to put everybody that wanted to present on the program. And so you had a lot of folks that were presenting papers, sometimes only 10 minutes long, and it was pretty quick. But some very interesting papers were presented, and funny things happened in one meeting. I think it was the one in Boston. Charles Adler, who was a physician from our own medical center that we taught how to do biofeedback, and we had suites in his, he offered us some room in his suites to start our own first clinic, first private clinic. I guess it was the first private clinic in the world, actually. It was probably about 1970 or 72. But anyway, Charles was he wanted to go to one of the annual meetings, and so I said, well, why don't you come to Boston? We're having our annual meeting. And so he came, and about the second day he came up to me. I was program chairman. I was rushing around like crazy trying to get everything done, and he said, Tom, you haven't introduced me to anybody. And I said, oh, well, gee, Charles, I've been pretty busy. So I introduced him to a couple of people and went back to, the hurly-burly of getting people ready to go. We were overlapping with the psychophysiology guys, and they were always making more demands on us because they'd been in business longer, and Martin Orne particularly, And so I was dealing with Martin Orne, and that night Charles called a meeting in his suite of all the physicians that were there. And essentially what he said was, we have to take over this group because we're physicians, and this type of thing should only be done and run by physicians. And so he tried to organize them so that they could take over the biofeedback group, and it didn't go very far, but he gave it a try anyway. And of course, in Congress in Washington, there was a lot of problems in the mid-70s. When I was president, it was 74, 75. They were trying to say that, make a law that only medical people could administer biofeedback. And by medical people, I mean doctors, not nurses, but doctors. And so there was a big fight. We had a lobby, and we had a lawyer that we hired and everything else. And Fran Butler was heavily involved in that by that time. Fran was the secretary for Johann Stoive and I at the medical center in the very early days, and we used her as a secretary for the first couple of meetings to get paperwork done and get all that stuff ready. And then she started making more phone calls about getting the hotel lined up, and eventually transitioned into being the head gal when it came to planning and scheduling meetings. But that's how it all started. She was our secretary at the medical center. Eric Pepper and I presented our first professional papers at Snowmass, I think it was, in Aspen, at the pain conference. It was an international pain conference, and it was like we were there for the whole week, and we didn't present to the end of the week, so we had all week to worry about it. I didn't enjoy skiing at all until that day. And after that day, which was I think a Thursday, then I could enjoy skiing. And my impression of Eric was funny. Of course, he was born in the Netherlands, and he had a pretty thick accent, and he worked with Mulholland in Boston for a couple of years. And Mulholland used to describe Eric's speaking technique as sort of squid-like, which meant he would throw out all kinds of sentences and hope that something would stick. Not having the appropriate grammar or anything, he would just toss out all these words really fast, these concepts and ideas and so on, and hope that some of them would stick with the people in the audience. And so that's what his speech was like. And I'm sure mine was someone quite frightened at the time. I don't know anything about that. But one time, a couple of years later, the BBC came through. They just finished filming the Beatles, and they came around to our lab, and I think a few other labs, maybe Manager, and filmed us doing biofeedback. And they gave us some outtakes, which I've subsequently lost. But one of them was of Johann Stoive, and they lit him from down below. The big lights were on the floor, and if if you light somebody, like, you get these terrible shadows, so it looked like Dracula speaking. And but these people that do these kinds of documentaries, they always like to make scientists look evil somehow, either in what they're saying or the way they look. And so I ran across that the other day. Jay Gunkelman had this as a file, and he gave it to me as a download. And just 2 days ago, I just happened to discover it on my laptop at home, and I said, what is this, And I opened it up, and it was this old film. And it shows Johann and I walking by the medical center, and I'm doing relaxation with somebody. My hair is real long, and I'm talking about relaxing the frontalis EMG, you know, and stuff like that. And Gary Schwartz is there with his sunglasses, hair blown all over the place. They shot him outside. It was snow in the background at Harvard, I guess, and Gary's got this great big black coat and his hair spread all out and these sunglasses. You wouldn't know who it was. And he's moving like he always does, you know. And they had Neil Miller, Barry Sturman, of course, you know, and Elmer Green. And some of the boys from New York University, Brudney and a few others that were doing muscle work, you know, rehabbing muscles, a la John Basmajian, of whom they featured some of the film too. And so this rare old film was quite intriguing. I haven't even looked through the whole thing yet. I didn't have time, but I'll review it when I go home. But there's one that somebody should have in an archive someplace, you know. It's kind of rare. But everybody was so full of promise and everything at that time. There was one guy that Johann used to get a big laugh out of. It was one, I don't even know who he is anymore. He wasn't a really big name, but he was one of the Eastern establishment guys that was working at New York University, I think. And he said things like, we've got to be very careful. In fact, Neil Miller said somewhat the same thing. We have to be very careful to document everything. It's going to take a lot of research over many years, careful documentation. He went on and on like that, droning away like everybody does when you're a researcher making a documentary. And Johann got a big kick out of that because it's so typical, you know, of how to cover your ass, you know, when you get in film that way, you know. But that was a funny kind of film. I never did get to see the BBC production, which must have been interesting. But one of my nieces, one time back in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in one of her grade school classes, they were being shown a movie on muscles. And suddenly, there I was, her uncle, presenting on biofeedback of muscle feedback. And she was really shocked to see that. And she shouted, "That's my Uncle Tom," you know. Everybody looked at her. The teacher looked at her and said, "Do you know that guy?" You know, and she said, "Yeah, that's my Uncle Tom." You know, so it's a proud moment for her.
Nice to be famous.
Yeah, slightly, right. There's one other thing maybe I should mention. We had trouble publishing in those days, as you can imagine, in reputable journals. And Niels Bierbaumer, at that time at the University of Munich, was getting ready to publish a book on behavior therapy. And we had sent him a paper, somehow we got acquainted with him, we sent him a paper that we'd done on anxiety with neurofeedback. And he liked it and he wanted to publish it in his book. And then after that, Elmer Green called me and he said, they asked me to come to East Germany to present on biofeedback, but I've got a conflict. Do you want to go? I'd never been to Europe, so I said, yeah, great, I'll jump at the idea. So I went over there, and I was going to do a talk for Bierbaumer at the University of Munich on Saturday, while I was going to go into East Germany early in the week, like on a Tuesday or something, and be at their conference, present my paper, and then fly back to the University of Munich and present on Saturday. And that's how I arranged my schedule. Well, as soon as I got into Munich to begin the trip, Niels met me. And in the days of the DAZ of jet lag, he said, can you change your schedule a little bit and can you do it on Friday instead of Saturday? And I apparently said yes, although I don't remember a thing about it. And away I went through a great adventure going to East Germany through the Iron Curtain. This was about 1973 or 4. And presented the paper in Germany at Erfurt near Leipzig, and it was quite interesting. And I went to Berlin and I was taken by the Minister of Health up as a tour. We went up in the tower there and went around. She told me the story of the Berlin Wall, you know, from their perspective. Brought me down, took me to near Checkpoint Charlie. She had to leave me off about 2 blocks from it. She says, "It's as close as I can get. You have to walk from here." And I walked into Checkpoint Charlie. It was at night. It was very dark and rainy, just like a movie. And they let me go through real quickly. They hardly asked me any questions. I was very surprised. Wished me well, and suddenly I was in West Berlin and took a cab to the airport, and flew to Munich. I get to my pension, and the lady says, "Oh, Professor Budzynski, where have you been? You were supposed to do a lecture yesterday. Professor Bierbaumer's been calling all day." And I dimly remembered something, but I couldn't get it out of my brain. The jet lag had been so much that it just destroyed my short-term memory. So anyway, Niels was gracious enough to call the students back on a Saturday, and I presented on Saturday instead. And then I went to Oxford. This was all on the same trip. And they'd asked me to present something on biofeedback at Oxford. And so I went there, and that was very interesting. They had me talk to the Department of Psychiatry, and we sat in this beautiful room, high ceilings, oil paintings, chairs all around the periphery. As soon as we got seated, a bell rang, and in came a little cart with goodies on it, cookies and cakes and tea and coffee. And they all balanced them on their knees, They knew how to do that. And I wasn't good at that. Besides which, I had my notes, too, so I had to put it down on the floor, and I had to keep bending down and getting the stuff, taking my notes and talking about it. And they called it biofeedback. And so, well, all about biofeedback. And so I did that, and we had a very nice kind of thing went on for a couple of hours. And then we all went to lunch. And lunch was in this very special room with a long table. And here were all the dons lined up. And it was a brunch. Across from me is Tinbergen. And Tinbergen, at the end of the meal, says to me, "Okay, Dr. Budzynski, what's all this about Watergate?" Doesn't want to know about biofeedback, wants to know about Watergate, which just broke in the United States. And so I spent the whole half an hour talking about Watergate, and everybody's looking at me from down the table. They all want to hear. They love scandals in England. See, so Watergate was a big deal, a really big deal. So I never will forget that day. That was a very, very exciting day for me, and one I'll never forget. I have a very good visual memory, and I can remember things quite well from my whole past life. And so that's kind of neat. But I could go on, but that's probably enough.
Let's go the other direction. You have any predictions for the future of biofeedback?
Oh, well, I think, I think devices will get smaller and be placed on the body in different ways in different places, and there will be implants of various kinds that will be used, and implanting, even into brain tissue itself, and first with muscle movement and later on into visual centers and things like that, with feedback of different conditions in the body being monitored, and feeding back to the brain evidence of what's going on in those things, like joint activity, for example, or hormonal secretions and colon activity and that sort of thing, so that we won't have just the body's own awareness of something going wrong, but we'll have these very, very sensitive biofeedback systems that will be defining areas that need watching and need care. And they'll probably have their own dispensers that will dispense things too as well. So that's what I think where it might be going.
Any advice for the new students entering the field?
Well, it's a difficult field because it's not totally accepted yet, so you're going to have to come into, you're going to face almost every day people who do not agree with you with regard to its efficacy, and they're going to have all kinds of either total disregard for what you're trying to say, or a disdain kind of attitude, sarcasm and whatever. I've lived with that for over 30 years, and so I'm very familiar with that. But then again, you'll hit pockets of areas, especially when you lecture to your own people, in which you get a tremendous high or reward, which I've always done. When you see faces light up in the audience, you know, with something you've just told them, that's a breakthrough kind of thing. It's the greatest joy that a scientist gets. And that's something that I suppose can be matched by other kinds of endeavors in life, but it's the one thing that the scientist has, you know, that's very rewarding and makes you feel very, very good. Every time I come back from a conference, I feel terrific. I feel 100%. All my ailments are gone for a while, you know, and my depressions are all gone, you know, and all's right with the world. And so I just love to go to conferences and love to meet the people that I've been around. Even if you only see them once a year, it's a tremendous high to do that. And so if you're going into biofeedback and research and even clinical biofeedback, you do want to go to workshops and get the knowledge that other people have, and go to the conferences and you know, and hear these wonderful papers that are being presented. They represent an enormous amount of work for the people presenting, and then someday present yourself, your own work. And that's really the cream of it all, is when you present your own work and it's accepted.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Okay.